this service. They're making a shamble out of it. I mean, you know, probably what some Baptist churches are doing today. But we see here, we see a confrontation. And Jesus knew their heart, because he said, Jesus read their minds. Because what they were thinking was, why is he saying sins? The man obviously can't walk, and Jesus is talking about, I'm going to forgive you sin. But notice the moment he said, thy son, thy sins be forgiven. He got up and walked. He took his mat, probably without bed bugs, Brother Tom. Because when Jesus heals, everything is right. So he took the mat that he was sleeping on, the mat that they had hoisted him up on, and probably the men, and we ran out. The Bible doesn't say he came out the same way he came in, did it? He's a new creature. When you come to God, you don't go back the same way. He didn't climb back through the roof. See? So the thing is Jesus says to them, because he knows their heart, whether it's easier to say to the sick of the palsy, which is paralysis, thy son be forgiven, or to say, arise and take up thy bed and walk. In other words, what he's saying is anybody can say, thy sins be forgiven. But Jesus said, also, arise, take up thy bed and walk, to demonstrate who he was. Because the hearts were not right of the people that were in there, particularly the scribes in this case. You see? He says, whether it's easier to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and take up thy bed and walk, it's a question. Anyone can say thy sins be forgiven, but it's a test. And so what he says was, if this crippled man can walk, then he'll prove that he's the Messiah. See, that's what he wanted to do. So he says, rise up and walk. And see, we see that. We see all of these things that were coming here. When Jesus commanded the man to arise and take up thy bed and go thy way into thy house, he was proving who he was and who he claimed to be. You see, it was that test we talked about. And what he was trying to show, I think, was that by healing this man, he was proving what he was preaching. That you ought to now be able to worship me, or to worship me, the Word, by faith. You see? Because I'm worthy of faith. You can trust in me because why? I just did this thing. Not so that people can say, look at me. But so people can say, look at the Father. Yeah. And because I did this, you should be able to look at me on faith, not just to come in and to say, you know, for me to tell everybody to rise up something and walk, or to heal, or something like that. But to listen to the Word, you see? Notice he says the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. Well, while he's on earth, you see, he had power. Of course, thank God he still has power today, and we're still on earth. And as long as we're on earth, we still have a chance to be saved. But once, I'm telling you, the rapture comes and somebody's heard the Word, and you passed the track out and said something that was about the gospel, they're going to die and go to hell. Even if they don't, back in the, you know, in Revelation, even if they don't take if they heard the gospel, there's no way in. Their clay would have gotten in the way. So we see this. We see that Jesus is saying the place of forgiveness is here on earth. You know, it is. And I want to talk about right now, we talked about when Jesus is in the house, and now I want to talk about getting the clay out of the way, and then I'll close with all of it together. When Jesus is in the house, get the clay out of the way, because that's about the church, specifically. More so than I've already talked about. You see, this man was paralyzed, and we see, I've heard message after message about the men that brought him there, and they've all been great. I've heard message after message about about the four men, about the self-righteous religious crowd. We've all heard messages on that, and they certainly are great. And we've also heard a message about how, in fact, that the fly leaf of one of my Bibles I was studying, the guy who did the prison ministry came a few years ago, because I dated it in my Bible. I can't remember his name right now. It was in another Bible. When I was studying, said, did a message on this same thing. But it was a little different take, but of these same kinds of points that I'm mentioning here. The self-righteous, of the place where getting to God and that kind of thing. But I want to talk about right now about getting the clay out of the way. You see, These men wanted to get their paralyzed friend to Jesus because they couldn't get to him because of the crowd that blocked the door. And so they took this man on the roof of the house. And we've already talked about the kind of houses and how they were and the stairways that led up. And they dug through the layers of the roof. And when they did this, they experienced the grace of God. Sometimes we got to get through the clay to get to God. That's our flesh, you see. I believe that's a type of the flesh. Now, the Bible doesn't go into all the clay in this, but if you go back and study, and I challenge you to check it out for yourself. Don't listen to me. Check it out for yourself. You're going to see these houses were made of clay. You see? And what you're going to find is that they get down to Jesus. You see, the clay in the Bible is a type of the old flesh we got here. And so, when they get down to Jesus, Jesus does the impossible. But notice that before they could get to Jesus, they had to get the clay out of the way. Sometimes with us, if we would be honest, we got to get the clay out of the way. We got to get ourselves out of the way, let God take over. Got to get the clay out of the way. Well, we need to look at the person of Jesus here. See, when they got the clay out of the way, they could see Jesus and what he was doing. Same thing with us. When we put self aside, we can see what Jesus is doing. When we put self aside, we can read this King James Bible and study it and see what Jesus wants us to do. When we put clay aside, we'll witness like we're supposed to do. We'll do the things we're supposed to do. I'm guilty of having a clay wall. You see, we all are. You know, sometimes our attitudes, our actions, our affections, our fears, and I just listed a few things that failures. Sometimes we're foolish, sometimes we sin, sometimes we want to call it a shortcoming, if you will. Sometimes silliness, sometimes greed, sometimes we hold a grudge, sometimes we hurt folks. Sometimes we don't mean to. Sometimes our tongue gets in the way of saying what's right. Sometimes our mind gets in the way of worshiping God like we're supposed to. Because sometimes somebody sits in there, and I'm just telling it like it is today, so I hope it'll be all right. Somebody sitting here, and the stomach will be ground and say, "Dear God, Lord, have mercy." And of course, they're not saying that in a good way to God either. And they say, "I hope nobody goes to the altar, because that means that Sister Myrtle, Brother Trey, will have to play another stanza." Yeah. Right? Amen. That clay's in the way. Sometimes we sit there and we're tired. Myself. Yeah. Y'all ain't got to raise your hand. I'll raise my hand. Because we're human. And we have this flesh shell. The clay gets in the way. And we want to come to the altar. And we need to. 4 men carried this man. 4 men cared enough to get this man to Jesus. What if one of those men had the clay in the way? Think about it. Well, Brother Tommy didn't come with me. We just went to stay to the house tonight. I'll see y'all other 3 later. You should have to lay in bed tonight. Think about it. What if one of those men had the clay in the way, the flesh? Bible says 4 men, born of 4. 4 men carried him. See? Man might not have got saved there. See, we got to break up that flesh. They had to tear down the flesh. They had to break up the flesh. Sometimes we have to be broken. You see? Ourselves, our wretched flesh, to get to God. You see? When the clay is removed, they could see Jesus, and everything became more desirable when the clay gets out of the way. Because if you're in church and you're not enjoying Brother Chris preaching, and I'm going to take a sidebar for a minute. The clay is in the way. Because heaven is going to be like that. Now, that doesn't mean that, I'm not talking about conviction now. But I'm talking about, if generally speaking, if people go to church and they don't like to hear preaching, the clay is in the way. The flesh is in the way. You see? It is. He becomes more malleable, so to speak. He becomes more loving. He understands Jesus when the clay gets out of the way. You see? And that's what happens. You see? You can enter the presence of God when the clay is out of the way. I've been in services, and there's nothing wrong with having services where folks testify. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I get heartbroken myself listening to folks' testimonies, and I'm glad we do have services like that. Amen. I am. Some churches you do that. Oh, dear God, that's not on the script today. Yeah. Oh, yeah, brother. Hurry up, sister. Get on with it now.